Buy Devonta Smith. I think one of the easier transactions this week is to buy Devonta Smith. He only had 2 targets against the Giants. It was 1 target, depending on your source. That was just the second time in his career where he saw fewer than 3 targets in a game. It's not like the Eagles just stopped using Smith. He had a 91% route participation. That's right in line with his season-long average. The Eagles, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed, they have the 3rd easiest schedule for wide receivers over the next 4 weeks. They get the Bengals, Jags, Cowboys, and Commanders. Their rest of season schedule, the absolute best in the league. Things are set up very well for a Devonta Smith bounce back. Add Jauan, Jennings, and Ricky Pearsall. So Brandon Ayuk is now out for the year, and Deebo Samuel's hospitalized with pneumonia. The 49ers need Jauan, Jennings, and Ricky Pearsall. Now, Jennings was out in week 7, but we saw what Jennings did earlier this season. He's had a really good year to date. Even with Ayuk in the mix, Jennings has hit at least an 11% target share in every single game this season. And we all remember what happened in week 3 against the Rams. He scored 46.5 PPR points. So to me, I think Jennings is the top priority this week. But keep in mind, he's dealing with a hip injury. And that's where Ricky Pearsall comes in. Pearsall made his debut in week 7. He led the 49ers in routes run. Now, he only caught 3 balls for 21 yards, but he had a 16% target share. That's not too bad. Pearsall was an older prospect, but what the Zap model liked about him is that he showed off a lot of versatility in college. Kyle Shanahan can do a lot with Ricky Pearsall. And anytime there's a good rookie like Pearsall is, who's walking into a really good opportunity, you should give them a serious look off the waiver wire. Now again, Jennings is probably the preferred choice here just because of how he's performed this year. But I think that Pearsall actually has more upside than what the market currently believes. So I think being aggressive with both of those wide receivers this week makes a lot of sense. And then for deeper formats, don't forget about Jacob Cowing either. He was a highly productive wide receiver in college. He might get more opportunities without Ayuk. So I'd rank them Jennings, Pearsall, and then Cowing. But I think all of them, especially Jennings and Pearsall, need to be added relatively aggressively, especially during a week where there's not great waiver wire options. Sell Najee Harris. It's not very common for me to repeat a transaction week over week, but in this case, I think I have to. Because I do think that even after Najee Harris's good week 7, he's still a sell candidate. He's now had 2 great games in a row, but there's still a lot working against him. Number 1, unsurprisingly, his snap share has fallen with Jaylen Warren back in the lineup. It was 48% in week 6. His snap share was 50% in week 7. Those numbers were closer to 70% without Warren. He's also losing work as a receiver. That's the second thing. Over the last 2 weeks, Harris's route participation, 36% and 32%. Again, those are with Jaylen Warren. He was well above the 60% mark without Warren. That's led to 2 straight games with target shares below 10%. And then lastly, schedule's not everything, but it's definitely something. And I've talked about this before with Harris, but in the fantasy playoffs, in weeks 16 and 17, the Steelers get the Ravens and the Chiefs. Those are 2 of the toughest matchups that you could possibly find across the league. Now look, calling Harris a sell last week, that wasn't a good idea because he had a decent outing in week 7. He scored 16 PPR points. So I'll take the L there. But I would not expect this to be the norm moving forward. And even if it is the norm, good luck using Najee Harris in the fantasy playoffs. I think there's going to be a lot of volatility there. Add Jaylen Wright. Jaylen Wright's been brought up in this podcast in the past, but with Tua Tagovailoa potentially coming back from his head injury in week 8, there's more reason to be into Wright. Now, he is the number 3 back in that backfield, but he probably has the best per rush numbers of the 3 running backs this season. That's him, Devon Achane, and Raheem Mostert. He leads Achane and Mostert in yards after contact per attempt, rushing yards over expected per attempt, EPA per rush, and success rate. It could only be a matter of time before his workload increases, especially with Achane and Mostert just being ineffective this year. And if that happens, if Wright does get more work, it's going to be in an offense that's hypothetically more efficient than what this offense has been without Tua. And it doesn't hurt that Miami has the best schedule for running backs over their next 4 games. So yeah, I'd rather have Achane. I'd probably rather have Mostert still. But those guys aren't available in a lot of leagues. Jalen Wright is. Buy Tyrone Tracy. So we saw Tyrone Tracy for 2 weeks without Devin Singletary. He played as a bell cow for the Giants. With Singletary back in week 7, we weren't totally sure what that backfield was going to look like. And honestly, it was kind of awesome for Tyrone Tracy. He didn't put up monster numbers against the Eagles. He only had 6.2 PPR points. But he handled half of New York's running back rushes. More importantly, he ran 27 routes according to PFF. Devin Singletary had 6. Now, the Giants' game script against Philadelphia, it was a little bit wonky. And it's definitely concerning that they didn't have Andrew Thomas this past week, and all of a sudden, their line got destroyed. So I think there is a lot of risk with this transaction. Don't get me wrong. But this could just be the start for Tyrone Tracy. This is evidence that they're going to use Tracy more than Devin Singletary. Maybe they didn't use Singletary because he was coming off that injury, but Tyrone Tracy has been the better running back this season. And at the very least, if he's the receiving back, which makes total sense given his skill set, these potential negative game scripts that the Giants are going to face, that's a good thing for Tyrone Tracy. Or at least it's not a terrible thing. Had Tracy posted awesome numbers, this wouldn't be an easy recommendation. But he didn't. So there's going to be plenty of non-believers out there. Don't be one of them. This is the right kind of bet to make at this point in the season. Add Keon Coleman. So the Bills added Amari Cooper last week, and then Keon Coleman, he goes out and scores a season-high 16.5 PPR points. This is why we love fantasy football. Coleman hit a season-best 21.9% target share on Sunday. That led to his strong performance against the Titans. Look, he's a solid rookie wide receiver in a good offense. There's nothing wrong with adding that kind of player or having that kind of player on your roster. But after just 1 week, the narrative has largely changed. Or at least for some people, it's changed. The narrative went from Keon Coleman is dust with Amari Cooper in town to Amari Cooper can help open things up for Keon Coleman. His presence can help Keon Coleman. And I'm not buying that. I mean, I'm buying the idea that Coleman can be more efficient. I'm just not buying the idea that Amari Cooper is going to make him a better fantasy asset, especially from a ceiling perspective. The fact is, guys, Amari Cooper, he ran around on just 34% of Buffalo's dropbacks on Sunday. That's not the usage that we're going to see from Cooper week in and week out. He's their number one wide receiver. You think they're going to have a 34% route participation for Amari Cooper all season long? Of course not. Keon Coleman saw 7 targets. And after watching that game and looking at the film, none of those targets came with Amari Cooper on the field. Unless the Titans secondary was distracted by Cooper hanging out on the sidelines, Cooper had absolutely nothing to do with Keon Coleman on Sunday and that explosion that we saw. If anything, you guys, we could use this as evidence against Keon Coleman because he was only targeted when Amari Cooper wasn't on the field, which means when Amari Cooper was on the field, Keon Coleman didn't see a single target. Look, I think that you should add Coleman and he should be rostered. As I always talk about on this show, rookie wide receivers, rookie players in general, they tend to do a lot better during the second half of the season versus the first half. But don't start creating narratives. There's absolutely nothing to the idea that Amari Cooper, because of this one game, is good for Keon Coleman. If anything, we could use that in the reverse and say that he was bad for Coleman. If someone in your league is believing that idea, believing that narrative, then you could add Coleman this week and hypothetically trade him. Hold Braelon Allen. So Breece Hall's seen an uptick in backfield share ever since the Jets made their coaching changes. That's hurt Braelon Allen. After 4 straight games with at least 1/3 of the Jets' running back rushes, Allen's been around the 14% running back rush share range over his last 2. He's not startable. You can't even throw him in your flex. But don't drop him. We're in the thick of it right now, guys. Injuries are inevitable. Allen is still one of the best handcuffs in the game. And the Jets have arguably the best rest of season schedule for running backs. So if Hall were to go down, not only should we feel confident in Braelon Allen's talent and what he could do in that backfield, but that's against a really good schedule too. Just because he's not a flex option anymore doesn't mean that he's droppable. Add Cedric Tillman. The waiver wire this week, it's not that great. So you're going to get a transaction like this one to add Cedric Tillman. I'm telling you to add a second-year wide receiver who had a historically bad yards per route run rate as a rookie. But look, Deshaun Watson, he's out for the season. Amari Cooper, he's in Buffalo. And without Cooper in week 7, Tillman saw a 25% target share. He caught 8 balls for 81 yards. The Browns are going to be rolling out Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, and Tillman in 3 wide receiver sets. Jeudy has not shown anything special. Elijah Moore has underperformed since his rookie year. Maybe Tillman will carve out a role in this Deshaun Watson-less offense. So you can add him this week. I just wouldn't spend more than a couple of bucks unless you're in a really, really deep league. Sell Tank Bigsby and hold D'Ernest Johnson. So look, a couple of weeks ago, I had Tank Bigsby as a sell, and that looks kind of rough today. To be fair, though, that recommendation, that was made before Travis Etienne's injury. I didn't know that Etienne was going to miss time. Had I known that, of course, I wouldn't have made Bigsby a sell. But regardless, it was a bad result. Now, considering the Jags' backfield just looks completely different these days, I thought that I would talk about Bigsby once again, because after a strong week 7, I think he's a pretty clear sell. The Jags' upcoming schedule, they get the Packers, Eagles, Vikings, Lions, and Texans. They're more than likely going to be pretty big underdogs in each one of those games. And that's a big problem for Tank Bigsby, because he's still not being used as the team's primary pass-catching back. Even without Travis Etienne. He did see a season-high 38% route participation in week 7, but that's still not an elite number for an RB1, for a top back on his team. D'Ernest Johnson, for a second straight week, he ran more routes than Tank Bigsby. Jacksonville was just fortunate to face New England. They had a nice positive game script against them. And that really favored Tank Bigsby's skill set. That's not going to happen each week, especially with this Jacksonville team, and especially with those upcoming matchups. So if you can flip him at a high, I think it makes a lot of sense to do that. And then don't drop D'Ernest Johnson. At the time of this recording, I don't know how long Travis Etienne is going to be out, but as long as he is out, Johnson could be a cheap PPR play. Buy CeeDee Lamb. It's been kind of a disappointing year for Lamb. He's averaging 15.4 PPR points per game. That's down over 8 points per game year over year. He's scored 20 PPR points in just one game this year. But I wouldn't be overly concerned. His output hasn't really been there the last couple of games in particular. He scored 11.4 and 16.1 PPR points. But in those games, he saw target shares of 22% and 33%. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, Lamb underperformed the last time that we saw him by 10 PPR points. He should have had a much, much better game. As I talked about last week with Dak Prescott, the Cowboys have a pretty nice rest of season schedule. They have the 5th best one for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And in the fantasy playoffs, in weeks 15 and 16, Dallas gets the Panthers and the Buccaneers. Those are 2+ matchups before an okay enough matchup in week 17 against the Eagles. CeeDee Lamb's bye week is already up. You don't have to deal with that moving forward. I think there's a lot of value here with Lamb. Add Hunter Henry. We've now had 2 Drake May starts, and in those 2 games, Hunter Henry has seen target shares of 16% and 25%. His PPR output, 13.1 and 17.2 points. New England's short-term schedule, it is a little bit concerning. They get the Jets, Titans, and Bears over their next 3. But this might be a legit connection between May and Henry. And considering the tight end landscape, Henry should be rostered in way more than 31% of Yahoo leagues. Sell Tucker Kraft. So if you're like me, you've just been riding this Tucker Kraft wave. He's scored 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games, and he's ranked as a top 10 tight end in 3 of those 4 contests. Now, there's nothing wrong with his route participation, but the Packers are more than likely never going to give this guy a really high target share in this offense. They like to spread things around. He's coming off back-to-back games with sub 13% target shares. He has 46 yards in those 2 games. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, Kraft has outperformed expectations so far this year by 3.4 PPR points per game. I think that he should still be a viable option each week. We're talking about the tight end position here. But if you can pair him with someone else on your roster to upgrade one of those positions, now might be the time to do it. This touchdown production, not totally sustainable. But I get it, there's a real chance that the market isn't that bullish. If that's the case, then you can just hold him and ride this thing out. Buy Xavier Worthy. So when Rashee Rice went down with a season-ending injury just a few weeks ago, many thought that Xavier Worthy would see a big uptick in usage. And that led to me making Xavier Worthy a sell within this podcast, within this 15 transactions list. Now, the market sentiment, it's probably changed a little bit. That flips them to more of a buy. Remember, this podcast and these recommendations, it's based on what the market is saying, more than anything else. My stance on Worthy hasn't dramatically changed, but the market stance might have. Because he really hasn't done that much without Rashee Rice. In his 2 games played without him, he totaled 44 receiving yards. But Worthy had a 32% target share in week 7. That was a season, and I guess career high. He had a 56% air yard share. That was another high. Based on his usage in week 7, he underperformed versus his points per game expectation by roughly 10 PPR points. Worthy has now seen his target totals at least stay the same or increase every week this season. And there's a lot up in the air at wide receiver in Kansas City right now. So it would be surprising to me if things trended in the wrong direction moving forward for the rookie Worthy. Add Bo Nix. Bo Nix has averaged 19.3 standard fantasy points per game over his last 3 games. But he's only thrown 4 touchdowns. How's this happening? Well, because he's getting it done on the ground. Over his last 2 games, he's rushed for 136 yards. This season, he's giving fantasy managers 6.2 fantasy points per game with his legs. Here in week 8, the Broncos get the Panthers. The Panthers are the second best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Broncos, they surprisingly have a team total north of 25 points this week. So Bo Nix is a great streaming choice. Add the Detroit Lions defense. The Lions are at home this week. They're 10.5 point favorites against the Titans. Tennessee has been the 5th most advantageous matchup for opposing defenses this year when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed, and only the Patriots have given up a higher pressure rate. All of that makes the Lions a great streaming defense. I've got 2 bonus transactions for you this week because we had a doubleheader on Monday night and some stuff went down. The first one's to add Rashad Bateman. He's had decent peripherals for a handful of weeks now. It's just been kind of tough to pull the trigger. But after week 7, where he caught 4 balls for 121 yards and a score against the Bucs, he has to be on your radar. He's seen at least 4 targets in all but 1 game this year. He's hit double-digit PPR points in 4 of his last 5. Now, it might be tough to rely on him given Baltimore's tendency to go run-heavy in certain game scripts, but he needs to be part of your consideration set this week off the waiver wire. And then unfortunately, we do have one more bonus transaction. And I say unfortunately because it's due to an injury. It's due to multiple injuries. In that same Ravens-Bucs game, Mike Evans left the game early after re-aggravating his hamstring injury. That could end up sidelining him for multiple games. But more importantly, at the end of that game, and I'm recording this soon after this happened, but at the end of the game, Chris Godwin suffered what appeared to be a season-ending ankle injury. Again, I'm recording this just moments after that happened, so I can't say that he's out for the season for sure. But plenty of Twitter doctors like Jeff Mueller, they're saying that this looks like a season-ending injury for Chris Godwin. So Mike Evans is hurt, Chris Godwin's hurt. What now? Well, someone like Cade Otton, he could get a natural boost in this offense without Evans and Godwin. But the player that I'm most interested in is Jalen McMillan. He had a really good collegiate profile after playing alongside Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk at Washington. One of his top comps in the ZAP model was Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see how the Bucs end up deploying McMillan. We know that Chris Godwin role, that slot role, it's a really great role in this offense. Jalen McMillan hasn't really played that role so far this year because Godwin's been playing it, but he lived in the slot in college. That's the role that he played. So it's a natural fit, in my opinion, if they want to put McMillan there. But regardless, He definitely is the most intriguing wide receiver on that team who has a chance to really step up. He's the player that I would be adding this week off the waiver wire.